evangelical gatekeepers like to define evangelicalism theologically. How do you know you are an evangelical and you've got your Bebbington quadrilateral or some other test, right? But you demonstrate that it's not nearly as clean as that a lot of times, I mean, it's not a surprise, that who is getting excluded? Black, feminist, gay, progressive. So it's race, politics, gender, and sexuality. Certainly race and politics and gender at least should not run afoul in any way of the supposed evangelical orthodoxy. So do you conclude that this is about social location masquerading as theology, or what do you finally conclude there?
It is a bit of both, and I think, and this is a question that I've wrestled with, and I had to put some guardrails up a bit for the dissertation on this particular aspect, because truthfully, I think it's hard to neatly separate these things such that we can say this. Oh yes, this is definitely theology, and this is just socio-cultural, political. I think humans, we're messier than that, and it's hard to sort between our own the things. It is hard to say this is just purely my theology and my theological motivations versus my social location. I think it is messier than that. But yes, one thing that I think is happening is gatekeepers using these theological or paying lip service to these theological criteria without acknowledging questions of power and social location going on with themselves and how they would be defining evangelicalism. And they may say it is about theology in certain times when it is about at least a generous read. It's not just about theology, right? Maybe that's giving a benefit of the doubt to those who would say that it is about theology. And I think one of the things that is if there is a way to diagnose some of what's happening there is you see this phenomenon where evangelical leaders and gatekeepers have the power to define what it means, refusing to acknowledge that it might be about more than just theology, right? So
let me ask you that, Isaac. Does that mean that evangelicals as a whole or at least white straight male evangelicals have a blind spot about power? This is about power, isn't it? Isn't your book really about power?
And that is a good, it's interesting when you think of a book, right? I think it's about a few different things. One of the central things, though, that it is about is power, right? It is the case that those with the power to define what it means to be evangelical had blind spots about certain things, and that is one of them. An example of this across the arc of 20th century evangelicalism, you have, and even to this day, you have scholars, and this cuts across insider outsider. Scholars saying things like, historically, the independent Black church traditions in the U.S. have all been pretty classically evangelical by theological definitions, and grouping, sometimes literally the scholars grouping Black church traditions as among evangelical Christianity. The only problem with that is there's a few problems with that. One of which is most of the folks in the historically independent Black church traditions would not identify with that label. So one of the things I wanted to do in the Black evangelicals chapter is ask why. Why is this, right? And one of the reasons why is you see, and this is one of my favorite sections of the book is in the Black evangelicals chapter about folks like Bill Pennell, who are diagnosing the uninterrogated white assumptions of the mainstream evangelical culture all the way back in the 1960s. Yep. So there are current debates among evangelicals about race is a hot topic among evangelicalism once again. And part of what I wanted to do in that chapter in particular is show this is not the first time that this diagnosis or discussion has been made. There were Black evangelicals in the 1960s who said things like, we believed all of the theology that you said we should to qualify as evangelical. You are my people theologically. This is what the Black evangelicals, some of the Black evangelicals said to white evangelicals in the 60s. And yet, that wasn't enough.
Yep.
You asked us questions like, what do you think about these riots in the streets with people like Martin Luther King? Who are you going to vote for in the next election? And would press on things like politics and things that are, that would be distinct features of Black cultural traditions. And all of a sudden, then something becomes questionable about one's theology if they don't align with the politics or cultural expectations. And you have this trenchant diagnosis from somebody like Bill Pannell going all the way back to the 60s saying, white evangelicals could not even acknowledge that what they thought they were teaching us was pure evangelical theology, but it was white evangelical theology, and they couldn't even see it, and they wouldn't listen to us say that. And when he made that diagnosis in the 1960s, I think that one of the striking things is that hasn't gotten much better, truthfully, in 50 years.
Yeah. In fact, you're actually being very polite. When you think about those, people like Bill Pannell and other voices from the 60s, I mean, they were wondering, what we're dealing with here, is this theological at all, or is this just whiteness proclaiming itself theologically? The other thing that I think is really interesting, among many other things, the feminist piece. If you go on Twitter today, any day on my Twitter feed, there's these brutal arguments on the egalitarian versus supposedly complimentarian thing. Hardly any subject is hotter. Kristen Dumais, Beth Allison Barr, and you're able to show that this same conversation also goes back to the 60s. Talk about that chapter.
That one is another, that section in particular, I feel like has, to your point, has so much relevance in these contemporary debates, and particularly in this way, in that something that happens frequently throughout the book and the stories that I try to tell is a debate will happen, and then it will get purportedly settled by some sort of power struggle, and somebody's pushed out. And then those folks,
a new faith statement is offered, and boom, it's resolved, right? Yeah,
that's it. And those folks who were dissenters, or even, if maybe not even as strong as dissenters, those who were who took a slightly different tack in interpretation, are forgotten totally and written out. The books go out of publication. They're pulled from libraries, and 10 years, 15 years, 20 years later, evangelical circles have the same debates and have the same debate again, right? And it is, and the debates over egalitarianism, complementarianism are a prime example. So much so, in fact, that and this is where sometimes I think that the work of historical recovery is so important, because it shows that these things didn't come from nowhere, right? Specifically in what's going on in contemporary evangelicalism, these debates over gender, complementarianism, egalitarianism in particular, the rise of complementarianism was specifically predicated on, and a response to the rise of evangelical feminism. You have these, so-called arch complementarian folks like Wayne Grudem, who, this is no secret, they openly acknowledge that they invented the term complementarian as a way to combat evangelical feminism. There was this evangelical feminist movement, and I never try to suggest that it was anything like a majority movement or something like that, right? It was never like the majority of evangelical culture, but it was a significant and growing movement. So much so that you have this group of theologians who come together, the folks behind this movement, this biblical manhood, womanhood movement, who come together specifically, explicitly, they say this, to fight and eradicate evangelical feminism. And it was an incredibly effective their work that they did to combat and marginalize and eradicate feminist ideas from evangelical circles was incredibly effective. And now here we are, it's a few decades on, and evangelical circles are relitigating this question of gender egalitarianism, and it's happening again.
Yeah, and the effort will be to crush the opposition and to erase them from the scene. And then 20 years from now, there'll be another generation. I'm old enough to remember some of those early generation evangelical feminists, people like Gretchen Hall. And I knew some of these folks, and they were devout evangelicals. They read scripture in an egalitarian way, and that was a threat.
And this crushing thing, particularly in this way. So this is this is one of the kind of things I think that differentiates in part what I'm doing from some other folks, especially, for instance, in the evangelical politics chapter. So, for instance, there are folks like Brantley Gassaway, David Swartz have written done fantastic work on the history of the evangelical left. A little bit of what I am doing is slightly different, I think, in that chapter, but also to your point about evangelical feminists is the crushing and eradicating opponents. One of the particular ways that it happens in evangelical circles across the story is to question someone's faith.
Absolutely.
To say particularly on the terms of you are not a real Christian, or you're not obviously, if you disagree with me on XYZ, be it gender, politics, whatever, you are not a real evangelical. And you see that particular rhetorical move time and time again in the stories to say, it's not just I disagree with you about this interpretation, it's that you either aren't a real evangelical, you're one of those liberal Christians, or usually implicitly, you're not a real Christian at all.